Hello, and welcome back to the National Book Festival Presents, brought to you by the Library of Congress. My name is Marie Arana. I'm the Literary Director of the Library of Congress, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce this program, part of our Timely Topic series, which brings you up-to-the-minute discussions about the pressing issues of the day. Today, we present two distinguished writers on the subject of politics, on both a national and international scale. Anne Applebaum and Carlos Lozada both are Pulitzer Prize winners, veteran commentators and cultural critics, and both have just published important books about what we are thinking at this very critical moment in time. Our program is called The American State of Mind. Anne Applebaum is currently a staff writer for The Atlantic magazine. For many years, she was a member of the editorial board of the Washington Post. She has been a chief editor at The Spectator of London, The Evening Standard, The Daily and Sunday Telegraphs, and Slate. Among her books are Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, which described the history of a very tenuous relationship between nationalities, Iron Curtain, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, and Gulag, a history of the Soviet concentration camp system, which won her the Pulitzer Prize. Anne is here to talk about her newest publication, Twilight of Democracy, a book that explains, with electrifying clarity, divisions among her own circle of friends as some drifted towards support of strongman cults, nationalist movements, and monolithic one-party nations. In the process, she addresses the general worldwide slide in this direction, as more and more liberal democracies have drifted toward forms of authoritarianism. Carlos Lozada is the nonfiction book critic of the Washington Post. Before that, he was the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. He is a versatile journalist who has covered the economy, national security, and a domestic and international politics for many, many years. But Carlos has also distinguished himself as a writer who can track major national trends and synthesize vast amounts of opinion. Just this past year, he was named the Pulitzer Prize winner in criticism. His new book, What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era, is a penetrating look at the vast amount of books published in the last 4 years. In the process, he tells the wider story of how we have come to understand ourselves during the Trump presidency. The book has been called crisp, engaging, very smart, and an elegant yet lacerating volume. Moderating the discussion between Anne Applebaum and Carlos Lozada is the Library of Congress's own John Haskell, director of our renowned John W. Kluge Center. The Kluge Center is a vibrant institution that supports scholars, conducts vigorous research, and serves as an essential resource for policymakers and the public. John, welcome back to the moderator's chair. Good to have you with us again. Over to you.
Thank you, Marie. Carlos and Anne, welcome to the Library of Congress. Anne, tell us about what inspired you to write The Twilight of Democracy.
My book was really born out of a reflection that I had starting a couple of years ago about a party that I gave in the house that I'm sitting in now. I'm speaking to you from rural Poland. This is a house that my husband and I renovated. It had fallen down. It had been destroyed, before, during, and after the Second World War. We bought it. His family bought it in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, after the fall of communism here in Poland, we began to rebuild it. On the night of the millennium, December the 31st, 1999, we had a party here, and the party was, of course, it was partly a celebration of the house that we'd finished. It wasn't quite as finished as it is now, but the roof was not caved in. But it was also a moment of great optimism here in Poland, but also in Europe. A feeling that Poland had overthrown communism, that it was joining the West, that it was going to be soon integrated with Europe. And most of the people who were there that night, mostly Polish, but a few friends from England, from the US, felt the same way. 20 years later, the people who were at that party now, about half of them no longer speak to the other half. And it's not a personal conflict, it's political. And their political paths have diverged very deeply. Some of my friends are still part of what I would call center-left or center-right political parties and movements. And some of them are part of a much more radical form of right-wing politics, kind of populist authoritarian party that is now ruling the country. And the book started out of me trying to explain, first to myself and then to others, what had happened. And why did one part of the people who I know turn away from democracy and begin to look for a different set of political answers? And there is not one answer to the question. There are personal reasons, there are political reasons. And I also realized that this was a move that had happened not just in Poland, which is where I lived part of the time, but also in Britain, where I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years as well, and in the US, where I'm from, as well as in other European countries. And my book attempts to explain that. It's not a book about mass politics. It's not about why people vote for populists. It's not even about the populists themselves. It's not a book about Trump or Bolsonaro or Viktor Orban. It's a book about the intellectuals, the journalists, the political theorists, the political strategists who have created these movements. And the reason I chose to write about them is because I know some of them. And the book is about them and how they changed and why.
Carlos, for your book, what led to that? Your book is called What Were We Thinking? What led you to write that?
So it began almost accidentally for me when Donald Trump was first running for the Republican nomination and suddenly doing really well in the polls. I had just become the Washington Post nonfiction book critic. And so I thought I'd just read some of his own ghostwritten books to see what they revealed about him. I remember my editor telling me, that's a great idea, but really you should hurry up because who knows how long interest in this is going to last. And of course, that was the summer of 2015. So I read 8 of his books and wrote a piece about them for the Post. And I really thought that would be that. But then he started winning primaries. And suddenly the focus of interest shifted to his supporters. And all these books about the white working class started coming out, books like Hillbilly Elegy and White Trash and others. So I read and wrote about those. Then he wins. And suddenly you have all these resistance books starting to come out. So I started reading those as well. And that's when I sort of realized that this was now my beat. That all the big debates of the Trump era over truth and identity and immigration and race and justice, that they would all generate their own mini libraries. And I decided I would read as many as I could, whether one at a time or tackling them in groups. And I think it was probably shortly after the midterm elections, maybe early 2019, that I thought about trying to assess them collectively to see what they were saying together, because I guess like Anne, I was also interested in how the intellectuals and academics and journalists were grappling with this period. I thought at first it would just be a piece for the Sunday Post, which I actually began writing. But after a few thousand words, I realized 2 things very quickly. I had a lot more to say than I could possibly say in a piece for the Sunday paper. But B, I also knew that I had to read a lot more, that there were many books that I'd missed along the way and books that I knew were coming. And that's when it struck me that a book project would be the way to really do this. And so I took those few thousand words and kind of massaged that into the beginnings of a book proposal. When I began writing it, I had no idea where I would end up with it. In keeping with the way that I write book reviews, I didn't show any drafts to anyone. I keep it very, very private, except for my editor. But overall, I just really wanted to capture a snapshot of how the thinkers in this time were wrestling with Trumpism. And I wanted to remind myself, too, for later, how I thought about it at the time. So in that sense, I think it's it's billed as an intellectual history of this time. I would say it's probably just a real snapshot that I hope that in the future intellectual historians might look at to try to get some sense of what was going on in in the sort of writing and thinking world during this period.
And why did so many journalists, intellectuals, public servants, why did so many of them move to the right, to the extreme right in Poland and other places?
So there isn't a single answer. And in the book, I look at very specifically, actually, at a few people's careers. And for example, the career of the person who's now the head of Polish state television. I actually look at the career of Laura Ingraham, who's an American Fox News commentator who I knew slightly some years ago, and I read about her career too. I think if there's any unifying feeling or idea among them, it's the feeling of disappointment. So these are all people who are disappointed with their countries, who are disappointed with, in the case of Poland, with democracy, as it emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. In the case of America, there are people who are disappointed with the kind of country America has become. Sometimes it's to do with demographics. America's not the white Christian country that they imagine it to have been. Sometimes it's to do with morals. America has declined morally, or is messier, or is uglier, or is dirtier. And sometimes that's also combined with personal disappointment. Not always, but the feeling that, in Poland, I should have done better. I was a solidarity activist. Now it's 20 years later. I thought I would be prime minister by now, but I'm not. And so there was often a disappointment personally that, combining with the disappointment in the society, led people to look for alternative movements. And these alternative movements, this kind of alternative form of politics, also offered opportunities for ambitious people. So people who, weren't doing so well in mainstream politics or mainstream journalism somehow, got a rush of advancement when they were able to attract people to these new kinds of causes. And so attaching yourself to one of these, a rising populist authoritarian movement was a way of making a career. And so that doesn't apply to everybody, but the feeling of disappointment, the desire for something different. And remember, radicalism, whether it's of the far left or the far right, always begins with this disappointment, because by definition, a radical or an extremist is someone who wants to smash up the existing system. So they don't see anything that can be salvaged. There's nothing good about my society. There's nothing good about my political system. The only solution is to smash it and create something different. This is the Bolshevik impulse. This is the far right impulse. This is the far left impulse today. It's fundamentally, in our societies, it's fundamentally anti-democratic.
And for a lot of the people that you talk about in that book and in other writings, they're subscribing to an ideology that they would have regarded years before as alien to them, right? So that's kind of the puzzle, that people are moving in a direction that they at one point strongly disagreed with.
Yes, you do need some way to explain why. For example, why American Republicans, who would have once described themselves as fiscal conservatives, believing in American power, believing in free trade, suddenly wound up supporting Trump, who ran this vast budget deficit, who reduced America's influence in the world, and who was an advocate of restricting trade. And you need to explain, why did they go from one set of ideas to another? And as I say, in some cases that's explained by opportunism. In some cases it's because they saw that this new ideology offered them opportunities that they weren't getting from the past. So yes, the book is also an attempt to explain why it is that people change their minds, why they swing from one direction to another.
Carlos, in the U.S., both sides of the divide say, well, the other side is much worse. In fact, to the point that the other side will destroy America. That's not an exaggeration, and it's kind of the core of what was called or is called the Flight 93 argument. You get into that question about, maybe the motivation is more about how bad the other guy is.
Yeah, during the 2016 campaign, there was an anonymous essay posted on the site of the Claremont Review, which was this sort of Trump-friendly forum. It was called the Flight 93 election, which you mentioned. And it argued that basically voting for Trump was like charging the cockpit of a hijacked plane on 9/11. You might die, but if you do nothing, death is certain. And doing nothing, of course, meant letting Hillary Clinton win. And that's the essence of what you're saying, which is sort of known as negative partisanship, right? It's not that you support your side as much as you really just hate the other side. The implication is that Hillary Clinton would have been such a destructive force as a progressive force for the nation that it would usher in all these horrors of taxation and identity politics and rampant immigration, that anything was worth it if it would stop her, including electing a risky candidate such as Donald Trump. Of course, that didn't come out of just nowhere. By this point, a generation of say Fox News viewers had been trained to despise Hillary Clinton with the heat of 1,000 suns. Two things I would point out about that essay in particular that I think are instructive beyond it. And that is first the author, who was later outed by the dearly departed Weekly Standard magazine as Michael Anton, who had served in the Trump White House as a sort of mid-level National Security Council official. In that essay, he spent a lot of time not just trashing Clinton and the left, but also the conventional right, the writers who believed in federalism and tax reform and sort of decentralization or something. Sort of he branded them as conservatism Inc. They're just weak and pathetic. And that points to the sort of nationalist populism as the way forward for the right. And second, Anton himself wrote a slim book a few years later, after he'd served in the Trump White House, called After the Flight 93 Election. And what's fascinating is that, when I first saw that he was doing this and when I first picked it up, I assumed it would be a no longer theoretical defense of Trump and Trumpism, but sort of making the affirmative case for Trump after having served in the Trump White House. But he doesn't, because he can't. There is no affirmative case. He merely expands the criticism of everyone else. Now it's not just Hillary; it's sort of the full left progressive agenda, and it's like sort of we're always on Flight 93, even if no one, as if no one has realized like who took the controls 4 years ago. So I think that is still the case, that even after a full term in office, Trump and his supporters it's the only case they could make.
Mm-hmm. And why is conspiratorial thinking a key part of the rise of illiberalism in Europe?
Conspiratorial thinking is a much underrated and much underappreciated means of destroying the trust that people have in their own political institutions. I watched this happen in Poland. I explain in the book. I give the background. There was a plane crash that took place here a decade ago that killed the president. And the details are in the book. I won't go through them here. It was an accident. It was caused by pilot error, probably also by the fact that the president was very eager to land quickly because it was an event in Russia commemorating a Polish war memorial, and it was the launch of his election campaign. And he was a president from this nationalist right party, which was not initially quite as extreme as it later became. His twin brother, who was the head of the party, in the weeks after his death, began fomenting this elaborate conspiracy theory, never quite saying exactly, there were often different versions of it, essentially saying that either the government or the Russians or some combination of the two, the government having been from a different party, from the center-right party, was somehow responsible for this man's death. And if you think about what that means, here is this one party accusing another party of having murdered the president. That's a very extreme accusation. But of course, we know this accusation from the United States because we had the experience of Trump entering politics on the back of birtherism, which was essentially an argument that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president. And, in both cases, if you're going to believe that the government murdered the president or that Barack Obama is an illegitimate president, that means that you're also saying that the entire political establishment, the government, the media, the press, the courts, the police are all covering up this terrible crime and this terrible, piece of this of illegality. And once you believe that, once you come to believe that, then you are in the world of people like Michael Anton, as Carlos has just described, in which you think that the whole system is so terrible, that the only thing we can do with it is crash it or destroy it or wreck it. And so conspiracy theory, particularly these conspiracy theories, as I say, that give people the feeling that the whole system is fake or rotten or captured by foreigners or by elites. This kind of conspiracy thinking very often paves the way for anti-democratic movements of the right or the left. I mean, if you look at the kind of language that the Bolsheviks used in the years running up to the Bolshevik Revolution, it's not all that different. But the idea that there's a conspiracy of rotten, fake, elite foreigners, and they are taking away our country from us. I mean, this is the classic way that anti-democratic or anti-pluralist political parties come to power. So the conspiracy theory plays a really important role in the story in all of these countries.
How do you see that in the U.S., Carlos?
Well, conspiratorial thinking has been it has a long history in this country, but it's certainly been at the core of Trump's campaigning and governing strategy, and brought up birtherism, the lie of concerning Barack Obama's origins, and that really enabled Trump's rise. But then he contested the legitimacy of an election that he won, the 2016 race, which he said he would have won the popular vote if not for millions of non-citizens voting illegally. Then the notion that Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower, that the Mueller report was a witch hunt by angry Democrats, and now of course the 2020 election has been stolen from him. There doesn't need to be a logic or consistency to these positions. If you look at how the Republicans right now are questioning the results of the presidential election, yet sort of exulting in the results of the Senate and House election, those are the same ballots, right? It's not like you can sort of like fake ones and not the others. So it doesn't really need to make sense. Trump changes his positions all the time, and you have his supporters and loyalists and apologists sticking with him because believing him is not about conviction. It's about allegiance. It's about loyalty. And Trump in particular is able to strengthen that allegiance and loyalty just through the power of repetition. So we hear all about, QAnon and these very elaborate conspiracy theories. But the notable thing about Trump's conspiracies is how uncomplicated they are. It's like one word, staccato, like hoax, rigged, fake, and just over and over again. And then, of course, what is dangerous is that he enlists sometimes the power of the federal government to try to retroactively prove or justify them. And that's when you see institutions start to crumble. There's an excellent book on this that I discuss a bit in my book. It's called A Lot of People Are Saying by Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum, about the particular brand of conspiracy that Trump peddles. If you read some of the 9/11 conspiracy theories, they're incredibly detailed and complex. And suddenly you're like discussing the different temperature at which different metals, melt and that kind of thing. Trump's conspiracies are nothing like that. They're one level above, I know you are, but what am I, right? It's ironic that Trump has discarded so many norms and lowered so many bars that he's even lowered the bar for conspiracies in a sense. So,
in political theory, in one way or another, the party system, has a lot of roles, but one of them is as I say, in theory, to marginalize the fringes in the system. And in Europe, in Poland maybe in particular, but maybe in other countries, is the party system failing?
So I think the party system has been failing for a long time, and it is the failure of the party system, among other things, that has helped create this anti-democratic wave. I think politics became, in a lot of our countries, and not just in the US, but all across Europe and other democracies around the world, politics somehow over the last couple of decades became the province of experts and specialists. And people began thinking of politics as something that, some people do in a room over there, and it really doesn't have that much to do with real life. And particularly, I think, as it moved online, it became even more distant. It was some, it was a form of entertainment or a form of, I don't know, of a kind of mass media that you looked at and laughed at, but it didn't have any sense of reality. And as that happened, the bonds that people felt to political parties and to political institutions as well grew weaker. Remember that we're also, political parties used to have a base in real organizations. They emanated from something real. So in Europe, you had this for many, many decades. You had politics was organized around this kind of center left. They were called social democrats in Europe. And those were people who came up through trade unions, and they knew one another through trade union clubs and organizations. On the other hand, you had Christian Democrats. It was a center-right movement, and they often knew one another through church groups and organizations. And they came out, again, they were born of real institutions. As both trade unions and the church played less and less of a role in real society, the parties themselves became somewhat fictional. They became kind of professional clubs for people who want to do politics rather than real organizations. And I think that was, they became weak. They became kind of meaningless to people. And then particularly because in the online world, we can all join, switching party allegiance or finding new identities is something you do online rather than in real life. I think that was an additional blow to them. So yeah, I think that the Trumpism in the US and the kind of nationalist populism that we have in Europe are both a reflection of the weakness of traditional parties and the shifting of party loyalties. And of course, they are hastening those changes as well.
Carlos, what's your take in the U.S. on the state of the party system?
Well, the two parties appear to be moving further apart, the left moving left, the right moving right. And this is part of the polarization and the negative partisanship that we discussed earlier. But it seems to be happening to differing degrees. Both the 2016 and 2020 elections show this difference. The Democrats ended up nominating in both cases the more centrist candidate, with Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders in 2016, and with Joe Biden over a field that was far more left leaning than he was, while the Republicans offered up Donald Trump. The gatekeeper function seems more alive in a sense within the left and the right, within the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. There was a book that came out a few years ago called The Party Decides, which stresses that role that the political parties are the ones that keep fringe candidates, from winning nominations and getting to power. But it seems that at least on the right for now, the party doesn't really decide as much as it has submitted. I think you're also seeing something similar on the left as what Anne describes, where if you read many of the books that are trying to understand what's happened on the left during this period, some of the more critical ones sort of suggest that the Democratic Party has to some degree moved away from sort of being that class, that party of labor, of working people. And in part, that's why you had voters switching from, longtime Democrats in some cases switching to voting for Donald Trump in 2016. To a significant degree, that's why Joe Biden won the nomination of his party this time around, in the hope that he could bring those people back. Not necessarily because he himself represents the future of the Democratic Party.
So, Anne, the title of your book is The Twilight of Democracy, and so that suggests that countries like Poland and Hungary are harbingers of what's to come. Do you still think that's the case? Have things changed? Are there any hopeful signs?
So Twilight of Democracy is not it's not pre-written. It's not a prediction. It's a warning. So we could end up in a post-democratic world. I'm not saying that we will. Look, I think the result of the U.S. election is positive. I mean, it did show that most Americans didn't want Trump and Trumpism. Joe Biden is in the end going to win fairly easily, even if you look at the electoral college votes or if you look at the popular vote. And you've seen a number of kind of liberal and centrist, center left and center right parties resurging across Europe as well. So I think there is a positive story to be told. I just don't think that we're out of the woods yet. I don't think the story doesn't end with one election. I would just draw your attention to what, as we're speaking right now, what's happening. Immediately after the election, Trump said he wouldn't recognize the result. Immediately, he and his party began fundraising on the belief that the election was stolen, sending emails and text messages to their supporters. There's already evidence that many millions of people believe the election is stolen and will go on believing that for a long time. And even if Trump will not succeed, whether it's his intention to overthrow the election or change the result doesn't matter. The point is that he's creating a base of dissatisfied, angry people, working, using a conspiracy theory, as we've just discussed, who can then be used for political or commercial or other purposes in the future. And so the ease with which this can be done, the ease with which you can still create a mass movement of people who think that the president is illegitimate, means that we have a long way to go and we still have a lot to worry about.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, you highlight many useful and, in fact, I think you even call them great books that have come out in the last 4 years. What guidance can we get from those books?
I can only share what guidance I got from them. Every reader brings a different set of preconceived notions to that exercise. First, I should note that really the most essential books to come out of the Trump era for me are not really about Trump at all. They're about the country. They show how so many of the fights that we're having now, whether over race or immigration or voting or belonging, are fights that are embedded in the American story and are ever present in this history. A book like America for Americans by Erica Lee shows how, alongside the nation of immigrants tradition in this country, we have an equally powerful strain of xenophobia, of rejection of outsiders. A book like One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson, does a terrific job of outlining the eternal struggle for voting rights and the sort of insidious evolution of voting suppression that we've long battled here. And a book like These Truths by Jill Lepore that looks back on those self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence and sees that struggling and often failing to live up to them is not just a feature or a hindrance of the American story, but its definition. To realize that those struggles are constant doesn't make today's struggle any easier, but it makes it a little bit more understandable. And I'd also point to excellent books on the struggle for democracy, such as Anne's Twilight of Democracy, which shows how this current anti-democratic wave is hardly ours alone. If there's anything that undercuts the sense of American exceptionalism, is seeing how we fall prey to the same forces undercutting democracy around the world, rather than serving as a bulwark against them, as America has attempted to do at some points in the past. And it shows us that intellectuals are often at the service of those forces, that sometimes you need those captive minds, so to speak, to make that happen.
And any closing words about the role of intellectuals in this climate?
I suppose the closing comment would be, about intellectuals in general. I mean, we have an elevated idea of the intellectual life, of people who think and write, that somehow doing that or being a person who does that makes you morally better or somehow elevated. I mean, look, being good at thinking and having ideas and being good at writing and being good at politics, those are skills that can be used in one direction or the next. Watch and pay attention to who's speaking and what they want you to think and what they're trying to persuade you of. Just because you disagree with someone's ideas doesn't mean that they aren't powerful, they aren't important, they aren't influential, and they aren't worth listening to and trying to understand.
And Carlos, thank you for joining us for this fall's National Book Festival Presents series. All of us at the library wish you the best.
Thank you, John. And a very big thank you to Anne Applebaum and Carlos Lozada for that very thoughtful discussion on the American state of mind. Please find many more fascinating author presentations about politics, history, science, the American lifestyle, plus novels of every kind, poetry, and books for children of all ages available right now on our National Book Festival website at www.loc.gov/bookfest. Until next time, I'm Marie Arana. Thank you so much for joining us.